There once lived a man whose name echoed through every corner of the nation, whispered in admiration by some and in fear by many. His wealth was legendary, stacked high like the towers he built in every city, polished and cold as the marble floors he walked upon. People called him the Golden Heir, the man who inherited not only a vast empire, but the belief that he was greater than all who lived beneath him, and so he believed it too. He walked as though the world had been built merely to carry his weight. When he entered a room, silence followed, not out of respect, but out of the quiet anguish of those who knew what his presence meant. Another day of being treated as though they were dust beneath his shoes. He spoke as though words were weapons. He looked at others as though their existence inconvenienced him. And above all, he lived with a laziness of spirit, a tiredness of heart. Not the kind that comes from exhaustion, but the kind that grows from believing one has nothing left to learn. Because what could a man like him learn? What lesson could touch a heart fortified by gold, comfort, and pride? His family watched him with sorrow. His father had once been a kind man, remembered by thousands for his generosity. His mother had been gentle, her words a balm to everyone she met. But their son, this heir of fortune, had somehow grown without their tenderness. Wealth had wrapped him like a cocoon, but instead of becoming a butterfly, he became a creature, unable to see past the glass walls of his own comfort. One evening, after insulting a servant simply for moving too slowly, he retreated to his grand estate, irritated that life was not flowing as freely for him as usual. The air was warm, heavy with the scent of growing grass and the rustle of leaves shaking in the wind. The world, indifferent to his frustration, continued at its own steady rhythm. But inside him, a storm raged. He paced through the corridors of his mansion, complaining aloud to no one and everyone. "Why must people be so slow?" he muttered. "Why must everything depend on my constant supervision? Why is everyone so incompetent? If only they had half my intelligence, half my talent, half my energy, then perhaps this world would be worth living in." He sat heavily on a veranda chair and looked lazily out at the garden. It irritated him to see flowers bending, leaves moving, life happening without his permission. A gardener passed by, greeted him kindly, and was met with icy silence. To the man, kindness was unnecessary. Life was a transaction. People existed to serve him. At least that's what he believed until the moment he saw the tiny creature that changed everything. It was just an ant, small, brown, barely visible against the wood of the veranda. At first he noticed it only because it dared to crawl atop his shoe. "Even insects disrespect me today," he sighed, prepared to flick it away without a thought. But something stopped him. Perhaps it was boredom. Perhaps it was fate. Perhaps it was the faint echo of a childhood lesson once spoken by a mother who loved him before gold stole her son. He watched the ant struggle with a crumb teeny compared to the world, but several times heavier than the creature itself. The ant pulled, pushed, adjusted, stumbled, nearly fell, but didn't stop. It tried again. Denobel. The man rolled his eyes at first. Stupid creature. Why bother? Leave the crumb. But the ant did not understand arrogance. The ant understood only purpose. And so, despite himself, he watched. Minutes passed. Then more. The ant tugged until the crumb caught on a splinter in the wood. It couldn't move forward. The man expected it to give up. After all, that was what he would do if something irritated him. Long enough delegate the work, complain loudly, or simply abandon it entirely. That was his way. The ant did none of those things. Instead, it adjusted its body. It pulled from a new angle. It shook the crumb to loosen it. And when that didn't work, it paused not in resignation, but in thought. And then, astonishingly, other ants appeared. 1, 2, 5. They formed a line, each touching the crumb, working together, their tiny legs pumping with a strength that did not belong to any one of them, but to all of them together. The crumb moved. Slowly, steadily. Inch by inch, the man leaned forward, forgetting his irritation, forgetting even his breath, as he watched the impossible happen in front of him. The crumb reached the edge of the wood, then disappeared into the grass, carried triumphantly by a team of tiny creatures who worked without praise, without reward, without arrogance. They simply did what needed to be done. In that instant, the man heard a voice not from the sky, not from the earth, but from deep within the chambers of his own forgotten soul. You, the voice whispered, who call yourself great, are weaker than the smallest of these. He sat back, stunned by the weight of the truth pressing upon him. The ant, a creature he could crush without effort, had just demonstrated more perseverance than he had ever possessed. More humility, more strength, more purpose. He felt something unfamiliar stir within him, but not the destructive kind, the awakening kind, the kind that shows a man the shadow he has been walking in, and the light waiting just beyond it. For the first time in years, he asked himself a question. Who am I, really? He thought he was powerful, yet he had no endurance. He thought he was wise, yet he had no humility. He thought he was superior, yet he produced nothing of worth with his own hands. He thought he was feared, yet in truth, he was simply avoided. He thought he was respected, yet even he knew, deep down, that respect demanded character he did not possess. As the night deepened, he continued watching the ants, one climbing a blade of grass, another carrying a leaf, others forming trails organized, purposeful, tireless, while he, with all his millions, felt hollow. He went inside and wandered through the mansion that once filled him with pride. The golden chandeliers suddenly seemed too bright, the marble floors too cold, the statues too lifeless. Everything around him felt like a monument to a man who had wasted his soul. He realized that he had mistaken wealth for worth, arrogance for strength, and laziness for peace. But observing the ant, the smallest of God's creatures, taught him the truth. That greatness lives in perseverance, in community, in humility, in purpose. And in that revelation, the man understood that his life had been built on the wrong foundation. Like a tower without support, he would one day collapse, unless he changed. The next morning, his staff approached him cautiously, expecting the same sharp tongue and cold eyes. But instead, they found a man transformed not suddenly, not perfectly, but genuinely. He thanked the servant he had insulted. He apologized to the gardener. He asked questions instead of giving orders. He listened. He considered, braided, and though people were suspicious at first, kindness repeated becomes impossible to question. Over time, the arrogance drained from him like poison leaving the body, and something new took root where pride once lived. Gratitude. He learned to work not because he needed the money, but because he needed the meaning. He learned to serve not because he sought praise, but because he finally understood the value of humility. He learned to see people not as tools, but as lives woven with their own fears, dreams, hopes, and sorrows. And every day, when weariness tempted him, when laziness whispered in his ear, when pride tried to rise from the grave he had buried it in, he remembered the ant. That tiny creature had carried a crumb heavier than itself. Yet he, a man endowed with every advantage, could not carry his own character without collapsing. So he practiced, and practiced, and practiced, until the day came when people no longer whispered his name with fear, but spoke it with warmth. Not because he was wealthy, not because he was powerful, but because he had become a man worth remembering. And as his life drew meaning from the simple act of living with purpose, he realized the greatest truth of all. It had never been the gold that made him rich. It had never been the power that made him strong. It had never been the admiration that made him worthy. It was the lesson of the ant that true greatness is built, not in towers, but in the quiet persistence of a humble heart. And so the parable ends with this eternal truth. Asterisk, if the smallest of creatures can labor with purpose, humility, and unwavering determination, then surely we gifted with thought, emotion, and the miracle of choice can rise above pride, overcome laziness, and transform our lives. Asterisk, for the greatness of a person is not measured by what they possess, but by what they choose to become. And sometimes, it takes the smallest teacher to awaken the largest change.